Okay, so some more information now on exam techniques. So you can answer your easiest questions first. So you can take a look at the whole exam paper for a few minutes, have a quick scan, and bypass what you feel are the difficult questions first. But always write the question number at the top of the page or marking it on your screen. And then spending time where the marks are. So typically in a CI exam, 1 mark will equal 1 minute, and that will equal 1 substantive point or a step in a calculation. So it's around about a minute a mark. But don't forget, for questions that you're really comfortable with, they're likely to be done quicker, and for questions you're not so comfortable with, they're likely to take a little bit longer. So don't hold yourself to that too much, but use it as a good guide. And finally, the CII adopt a positive marking approach. So you can't have marks taken away only when you contradict yourself. So remember on the question meanings before, we looked at those explain and describe questions, those technical questions linked to products and processes. So for example, if you were describing the taxation features of an EIS, and you were to write down in your answer that they were exempt from CGT, and then somewhere else in that example you got confused with an EIS and you wrote down that they were exempt from CGT after 3 years. The examiner would give you the mark where they see the correct answer, CGT exempt, but if they saw something to contradict that, then that mark would be taken away. So on those explain, describe and outline questions, please be careful making sure you don't hedge your bets or contradict yourself. The good news is that for all of the types of questions like benefits and drawbacks, recommendations and justifications, fact-finding and factors, if you write down an incorrect answer, it will just get ignored. So that's the good news. So whether you're writing your exam down with your own fair hand or typing on the computer, we recommend that you use bullet points, because if you looked at any past papers, you'll see that that is the format. So the idea of the game here is short and sweet, and try and use those key words or key pertinent points where possible. Leave space between parts of questions, again, whether it's handwritten or on the computer, to allow the examiner to see clearly which parts of the questions that you're doing, and don't bunch it all up. It just makes it far easier to mark, and also with that, far easier for you to have a check back and be able to read your own writing, or have it equally spaced on the computer just so you can give it a quick scan to see if you can find any more marks. I've already mentioned this, but it's really important. Don't contradict yourself. So especially on those explain, describe questions, making sure you don't essentially knock out any of the correct answers that you've put, taking that scattergun approach with those types of questions. Because if the examiner sees you hedging your bets or contradicting yourself, then you won't gain that mark, even if there's a correct answer put down. So if in doubt, put it down. That's the name of the game, especially on those fact-finding and list questions, because there's no negative marking, benefits and drawbacks the same. But I'll say for the final time, beware on those explain, describe and outline questions, contradicting yourself. So, in addition to our 3 golden rules, we have expect the unexpected, and I call this the curveball question. So in every exam that's been published in the past, there's always some kind of question, normally worth, say, 6 to 8 marks, where they're going to be either loosely or not linked at all to the clients that you've been given in the information for the exam. And it can be based from anywhere on those CII financial services syllabuses, so from R01 all the way through to R05. There's lots of examples in the past of what they've been, and they can, like I say, be loosely linked to the clients or have nothing to do with them whatsoever. So it's nothing to worry about. You can't really revise for it unless you were to look at every single syllabus on the financial services menu. But you've just got to be aware that it is going to happen. But if you do all the things correctly and follow all the technique that I talked about, it shouldn't make or break your exam. So it's a good idea to have a look at some past papers, because they do repeat those, what we call the generic questions. So a classic example will be how advisor fees are charged, for example, or the benefits of a financial planner to a client. those answers will be the same for any client and therefore are not necessarily linked to any clients that you have information on before the exam. Okay, so this is an interesting one, he says. This is your world versus the CII world. And the main point about this is that essentially there are things that the CII will do in their model answers that you wouldn't necessarily do in the real world, and vice versa. There are things that you would absolutely do in your normal practice with a client, but the CII wouldn't agree with that. But the good news is most of the answers there will be some parity with, i.e. you and both the CII will agree on a process or an answer to a question. A typical example of this will be, if you look back on any model answer, you will see, as long as the information isn't in the what you get before the exam, you will see the model answer of any expected inheritances when you're asking questions about inheritance tax or investments or retirement planning. Now, when I was an advisor many moons ago, that wasn't on my fact find. I did not ask any clients unless they divulged information whether they were expecting any future inheritances. So that's an example where the CII always ask it if applicable, but myself in the real world, I didn't. That didn't make me a good or bad advisor. But what we do know is that's a classic example where any future inheritances, as long as it's not known in the information you get for the exam, then that's a typical answer to any kind of fact-finding question. So hopefully you can understand that, and if you look back on any model answers, you will see things that you don't necessarily agree with, but we have history that the CII gives those marks. So it's kind of like, if you don't agree with it, fair enough, but bite the bullet on exam day, because otherwise you'll be throwing away some easy marks there. Another classic example on that one will be whether the client has any ethical views towards their investments, and that would always go in an investment fact-finding question, inheritance tax, and also retirement planning as well. So another tip for you there. Back to marking schemes now, and I might have mentioned this before, but just to be really clear, marks are awarded for key pertinent points. Now, sometimes it has to be those words. So, for example, if you were explaining the taxation of a personal pension, for example, payment in retirement, then any income is going to be subject to income tax, and there's no other word for income tax. So that's where it has to be a certain word or phrase. But then there are other questions where your answer can just mean what the key word is on the marking scheme. So a classic example will be diversification. So if that's the answer on the marking scheme, then yes, diversification is going to match that and you'll get the mark. But if you were to write spread the investment to the asset classes, for example, shares, fixed interest, etc., then that would equally get the mark, because that absolutely explains what diversification is. But I think you'd agree with me, the one-word answer of diversification is a lot more simple and a lot quicker to write or type. There will be more relevant, or many more relevant, accurate points than there are marks available. This is a good thing. So a typical fact-finding question, for example, might say 10 marks, next to the question in the brackets, to let you know what the maximum marks are available. Now, when you are writing or typing your answers, you always go through, I would say in that example, at least 2 or 3 more, because in all likely event, there's going to be 12 or 13 marks available on the marking scheme. And if you were clever enough to get all those 12 or 13 that are actually on that marking scheme for a 10-mark question, unfortunately, you still walk away with only 10 marks, because that's the maximum for the question. But the good news is knowing that fact that there's likely to be more marks available than actually what they're asking for. So this gives you a bit more scope and just more of a chance of tuning into that senior examiner's way of thinking. So that's a good thing. So always go the extra mile. Easy for me to say, but absolutely important that you do in practice. And then you will not gain marks for every point you write down, even if they are relevant and accurate. And that's because the senior examiner has the final say, and they dictate how many marks are available for a question. So, there can be an example where you put a really, really good answer down, which is absolutely correct. However, it's not on the marking scheme. And that will be because the senior examiner believes that the other marks that he or she has put down on the marking scheme are obviously relevant and correct. and are just more relevant than that great answer that you've put down. So by putting down as much as you can, like I said earlier, is the best way to try and combat this. It's frustrating, but you know that if it's a 10-mark question, there may actually be 20 plus correct answers out there in the world, especially when it comes to fact finding. So the examiner will always put a few more on the marking scheme, like I've said, in order to give you that scope. So you must write down all points that you can think of that could potentially attract a mark. So it's a write or type Britain is the name of the game for this exam. And it'll be the CII, obviously, that decide what gets the mark. So that marking scheme is signed off, it's discussed, there's various meetings in terms of fairness and what have you, and then there will be a final marking scheme. So your marker, if they mark your question and it's not on the marking scheme, once that's been agreed, then unfortunately they won't be able to give you the mark. And you won't know, which points actually attract a mark. So I wouldn't worry about, on exam day trying to, mark your paper mentally or anything like that. It's just do the best that you can, and then it will be marked accordingly. Okay. And on model answers, when you look back at past papers, you won't see the actual marking scheme of where the marks were given. You just see, those bullet points listed. So, but you should have a fair idea. And finally, combine your own knowledge and experience with the published CII past papers and whatever materials you're using, or if you're going on a workshop, to maximise your chances. So putting all those things together is going to put you in a really good place to pass this exam first time. And finally, on marking schemes, some more top tips in order for you to gain maximum marks. So always attempt calculations, even if you want sure the process. If you get some of the process correct, then you will get some of the marks. It's all about the method here. Love this one. Assume your paper will be marked by a simpleton. You have to explain all your answers. They are marking against the marking scheme, not their own knowledge from a marker's point of view. So you must put your answers down as if anybody can pick it up and look against a marking scheme and mark it. That's the best way to look at it, because if you haven't written it down or typed it in your answer, then they will assume that you don't know. Don't sit on the fence or be ambiguous, and that's especially true when it comes to recommending and justifying. When they ask that question, that's exactly what they want you to do, is to go for gold, be brave, make a recommendation, and then justify that recommendation, rather than giving the client options of what they may or could have or might be a good idea for them. They want you to recommend and justify. And on those explain, describe questions that I've talked about, those technical questions, again, not sitting on the fence and kind of like hedging your bets. Okay, so if you can't remember, the CGT situation for a VCT, you can't remember whether it's exempt or 3 years or 5 years, for example, you're getting all mixed up, then you have to pick one and go with that. Because if you hedge your bets on those questions, you won't pick up any marks for that point, even if the correct one is part of the party of answers that you've put down. So remember, your examiner assumes absolutely nothing about your answer. They can only mark what you write down or type. And finally, examiners have no discretion and cannot award marks for implied answers or really good answers, like I've discussed, that aren't on the marking scheme. So the best way to increase your probability of that not happening to you is to put more answers down than they are required for the marking scheme. So a classic example, fact-finding question worth 8 marks. Your goal would be to go for 50% more answers. So the goal there, easy for me to say, would be going for 12 answers for an 8-mark question. Okay, so time to have some exam technique practice. So over to you for this one. So here you can say some information on a client that's typically received before the exam. So I'm not going to read it all out line by line. So I'm going to ask you to pause the video, take a screenshot if you want to, and then the question will come up in a very short while. So go for a pause, have a good read, take a screenshot if needs be, or print out, and then the question will be coming up shortly. So, I promised the question, here it is. It's very similar to that one that we looked at earlier on in the video with that golden rule number 1. So it's recommend and justify a suitable policy to protect the family's standard of living in the event of Laurie being unable to work in the long term due to sickness or accident. Okay, so now you've looked at the question. The purpose of this exercise is not actually to answer the question. You can do that later on at your leisure. I'm going to ask you to become a marker. So the next screen is going to show you 2 answers. And I'll explain what I'm going to ask you to do. So as we saw in that question, it was worth 12 marks. So what I'm going to do is bring up 2 essential answers that have been created here. Okay, so the first one you can see here, lots of words there. And here is the second answer. What I'm going to ask you to do is to pause the video, have a really good look at those answers. So on the left hand side we have candidate A essentially, on the right hand side candidate B. So out of 12 marks, what I'd like to do is go through it, take some time, a good kind of like 10-12 minutes here, that's the time the examiner would take to mark this, and see what marks you give for each side of the screen out of a possible 12. So the amount of marks, and more importantly, where you gave those marks. And then after you've done that, continue with the video and I'll walk you through it. Okay then, so let's look at candidate A first. So in the red it shows where the marks were given. So we can see the total of 3. Did that equal what you gave? Was it more or less? But more importantly, we'll have a look at where the marks were given. So the first mark you see there is for PHI, or Permanent Health Insurance. You could have accepted income protection plan or income protection insurance. All those 3 terminologies mean the same plan. No mark given because he is self-employed, because you don't recommend it because someone's self-employed. That's just part of the deal basically. So whether someone's employed or self-employed is not a reason to recommend it. Then he doesn't currently have any way of maintaining an income, and this would provide him, Danielle, and the family with income over the long term if he were be unable to work. A couple of things that's wrong with that. There's no mention of a tax-free income, how often that income is going to be paid. We're looking for a regular income rather than a one-off piece. And also the phrase unable to work. We need to put why he can't work in order to claim in this policy. So, he can't claim if he can't work due to, poor sales or lack of demand for his business. It's got to be, due to sickness or incapacity or long-term illness. So no marks for that, quite a long piece of text there. Next mark though is there's a mark for the term, until he expects to retire, which is fine. And then we have a deferred period of short as possible. No mark there because, what does that mean? Short as possible, what's that? 3 minutes, 3 hours, 3 days, 3 weeks, who knows? And we all know that the shortest deferment period for an income protection plan is going to be for 4 weeks. So that's what needs to be put there because short as possible is just too woolly. But there is a mark given there because the CII always give a mark because what they understand and what we understand when it comes to deferment periods and income protection is that they can range from 4 weeks to 2 years, which has a massive impact on the amount of premium. So there's always a mark on the recommendation, well, for the justification anyway, to put a little piece around the ability to afford the premiums. And then the latter part of the answer from attitude to risk onwards is that he can consider a critical illness policy. So that is not answering the question because the question was, for a long-term illness rather than a critical illness. So all those words after that are going to generate no marks. So 3 marks for candidate A. So let's move to candidate B then. So we have income protection insurance, mark there. No mark for on Laurie as the main breadwinner because again, you wouldn't recommend it just because somebody is earning more than another client. Benefits of 50 to 75% of earnings, 75% being the absolute policy maximum there. If an amount had been stated that was reasonable, that would have also gained the marks. It's going to provide that tax-free regular payment. Yes, that's really important. It's telling the client in the justification it's going to provide that tax-free, which is important, and a regular income. You'd be fine there to put monthly, quarterly, but it's just that regular nature. And then we're also going to recommend and justify the own occupation. And there's a couple of ways to justify that, because you can put that it's more chance of a claim, or it's superior to any occupation in terms of the definition of the plan. So 2 marks there. Written to retirement or term to retirement, we have another mark there. And we have a deferred period of 4 weeks that has been stated there. The candidates put all short as possible, but because it's a recommend and justify, the examiner can just ignore that woolly point of short as possible. So the 4 weeks is given the mark. And the reason for that justification here is due to minimal savings. The candidate could have equally put a 3-month deferment period and said, the client has some sufficient savings that they can use in order to pay out that income. So as long as the recommendation, meets the need and it makes sense in the real world, then the marks will be given. Indexation of benefit also needs to be there, so another mark, in order to keep pace with inflation. So a classic justification there. And guarantee premiums rather than reviewable, because these provide a known cost. Again, reviewable premiums could have been recommended here, and the justification of that would have been, to keep the cost down lower in the first 5 years of the plan. So if you top that up, the candidate here got the maximum marks available, so 12 marks awarded. Nice, short, to the point, using those key buzzwords, so easy for the examiner to mark and a lot quicker to write or type. Notice that the recommendation wasn't made on the deferment period, that it was within affordability or subject to affordability. So that's an example where there may have been 13 or 14 marks available on the marking scheme, but the maximum awarded for the question is 12. So, essentially justification was missed off there, but the candidate still walks away with 12 marks. So well over 120 words for candidate A and only 3 marks, and less than 90 words for candidate B, but walks away with the full prize of 12 out of 12. Finally, we're going to look at what you can do before the information is released for your exam that you're going to be sitting shortly. Okay, so you might be asking yourself, what can I do before the information is released, 2 weeks before, for my exam, the one that I'm doing, okay? And you won't be alone in that. So my recommendations would be as follows, okay? And I'll justify those recommendations as well. So what I'd be doing is I would be looking at a few past papers, but I wouldn't, like another RO exam or another AF exam, I wouldn't really be, getting involved too deep with those past papers, because I wouldn't want to cloud my judgment with lots of different client details. I would be, looking at those past papers from a high level point of view, looking at the information, looking at the question styles, and then looking at the model answers and seeing how all those tie up. So I'd look at as many of those as time possibly allowed. And then in your exam, there are always key areas that are tested, those being protection, retirement planning, and inheritance tax. So sharpening your saw on inheritance tax planning, making recommendations, use of exemptions, looking at retirement planning, so looking at the use of flexi access drawdown versus lifetime annuity, and also that cornerstone of financial planning, looking at personal protection, whether that be life assurance for debts or family protection, critical illness cover, and income protection as well. Along with that one which we kind of forget about a little bit, which is a private medical insurance, PMI. Also, wills, power of attorney, regular areas that are tested in your exam. So it's a really good idea to get out the relevant RO study text or your old exam notes, whatever method that you deem necessary and which is going to work for you. Start creating mind maps. All those kinds of things are going to help you, so when your information is released a couple of weeks before the exam, you've already got some background technical knowledge which can only help you, and then you can fine-tune that for the details of your clients for your exam 2 weeks after that. So, hope you've enjoyed the video, hope you've picked up a number of tips there, which hopefully that means to you by watching this video, and I would urge you to watch it again and make some notes, or whatever's going to work for you. But at the end of it all, hopefully you're going to get more marks now. That was my aim really, more marks now than you would have done without watching it. So best of luck with your studies, best of luck with your exam, and hopefully I'll see you at some point in the future. Bye for now.